All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first keynote of the MAS workshop. So we have some new people joining online, some new people in the room. I'm Bella Struminskaya, Associate Professor at Utrecht University, one of the organizers of this workshop that we hold annually in different places. And I am beyond excited to introduce our first keynote speaker for the keynote, which is sponsored by Digital Societies at the University of Manchester. And our first keynote speaker is Helen Nissenbaum. And to present Helen's CV and describe her awards and achievements and publications in the software and the service for the academic community and beyond would take more time than we have allocated for our keynote, I think. So I'm glad to give you a short version. Helen Nissenbaum is a professor of information science and founder and director of the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech, New York City. Her work focuses on ethical and political implications of digital technologies and on issues such as privacy, bias in digital systems, trust online, ethics in design, and accountability in computational and algorithmic systems. Professor Nissenbaum's books and publications, which include the book that I find particularly inspiring, Privacy in Context, have been translated into 7 languages. And Helen has received grants from the NSF, Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Service Office of the National Coordinator, MacArthur Foundation, DARPA, and NSA. She is also the recipient of the 2014 Borweis Prize of the American Philosophical Association and the International Association for Computing and Philosophy Coway Award for Computing Ethics and Philosophy. Professor Nissenbaum has contributed to privacy-enhancing free software, Track Me Not and Ad Nauseam, which protects against profiling. Helen holds a PhD in philosophy from Stanford University and a BA with honors in philosophy and mathematics from the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Thank you again, Helen, for agreeing to speak at MAS. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And Bella, thank you for your amazing introduction. And I'm really actually feel privileged to be able to talk to you guys and share some high-level ideas about the theory of contextual integrity. What I hope, and there's a lot to cover, but what I really hope is that I get through it quickly enough that we can have a kind of conversation, because it seems to me that when I hear about your data collection efforts, whether through surveys or data traces, and the concerns about consent and so forth, this shouldn't pose privacy issues. This should be an easy case. And so I'm hoping that the theory of contextual integrity can provide some language or some structure to the kind of argumentation or kind of justification for the sort of work that you do. So that's just a preamble. And for the most part, I have slides that I use to go through the theory, and I've stacked them in a certain way, hopefully to do a good job. Also, to apologize in advance in case I head into a coughing fit, because I've been doing that for the last 5 days. And I'm going to try and keep my voice at a low level so it doesn't irritate. So this is something that I just, as you can see, it's 2022. Don't worry about the content of the slide, of the article, but it's the kind of thing that really actually upsets me when people say things like this: privacy at what cost? And then it's really tiny, but it's basically saying that that if people are more open about having HIV data flow into the study, then there's a greater likelihood of better outcomes for the treatment regimes. And then they say, unfortunately, privacy gets in the way of earning these benefits. So it hits, and you often hear this, privacy, we need to trade off privacy for other goods, or you might hear people say, oh, privacy stops us from getting these other goods, so privacy is a negative value. It's a dampener on good things, and this is something that I disagree with, but I think it has something to do with the way people have conceptualized privacy for so many years. Maybe willfully, I don't know. In my own work, I've been inspired, or what really got me to thinking about privacy is digital technology. So in the early days, I got interested in web search, and you heard we have Track Me Not, which is an obfuscation tool to obfuscate your web search profile, a little bit naughty, recently banned by Google, etc. But as you can, what was provocative for me was this realization that the search engines, even way back, when you would go to a search, web search tool, you would type your search term in. First of all, they're recording everything and saving everything you search. Second of all, when you click on a link, it takes you not directly to where you want to go, but through to the web search server, and then it records what your interests were, and then that is how a lot of the initial collection. Now, you could call this a data trace, and consider it exciting that there's this capacity to monitor what people are interested in. For me, it was a kind of a wake-up call. Or, for example, take this. It's a database created by a government agency. You have your buttons. I don't know how familiar you are. You probably are. I hope I'm not like singing, singing to the choir, or preaching to the choir. Which is that even if you put these buttons in there, the Twitter and the Facebook, even if you don't click on the buttons, Facebook will know that you arrived at this page. Of course, you guys are very well familiar with tracking technologies, IoT, and so forth, and there's been an explosion of those things. But generally speaking, what has continued to provoke my interest in privacy is the general array of digital technologies. And Bella mentioned the book. You'll be familiar with this way of classifying the different technologies that digital tech is so outstanding at, which is collecting, tracking, monitoring, the ability to analyze the incredibly sophisticated analytics tools. Now, of course, machine learning, AI, and Gen AI, generative AI, but some of the applications of these capacities, and of course the networking capacities to distribute in all sorts of forms. And what you may hear in response to any of these applications is like, oh, my privacy's been violated. And that was the wake-up call to me. What is being said? What is being challenged when people would say privacy has been violated in this way? So as you heard, I'm a philosopher, and a lot of what we do is a kind of conceptual creation or definition of a concept. And we have benchmarks. Well, what do I want out of my concept of privacy? And these are really important benchmarks for me as a philosopher. What do I want? First of all, the concept has to be faithful to common use. And you guys, I'm so excited because obviously survey methods have been an incredible way of trying to learn how do people think about it. Second, which is sometimes in contradiction with the first, is we need to sharpen, because obviously many natural concepts are a little ambiguous, they're a little fuzzy, they may even be self-contradictory. So what the analytic philosopher does, like myself, is we say, okay, we're going to kind of shape the common use so that it's nice and clear. Third, it has to, what I say, reveal privacy significance. So we're not simply describing the concept, because the concept of privacy carries moral weight. So if someone says privacy's been violated, that means, oh, that's wrong. We need to stop it. Something has to be done. So that if we're going to define what it is, it needs to be a defensible concept in ethical terms, and also very nice if it shows how to shape technology, and why the technology has posed risks, and can it now inform technology design and policy. And with my work in contextual integrity since the book, even before the book, some of the work that I've been doing by myself and with other people has been in all these different domains. So what I want to do in just the time remaining is to give you these key ideas. If you may hope, if your work becomes relevant to privacy. All right, key ideas. What is contextual integrity? So we have the key ideas. And then, as a contrast, what contextual integrity is not. Because sometimes to learn what something is, it's good to contrast it against something that it's not. Now the one-liner, this is the thing I wanted to get through to just this slide, and then if I cough the rest of the time, you'll have earned one thing. And that is the right to privacy, if you want to call it as a right, or you could just say privacy is a right to appropriate flow of information. And when we say why flow, the answer is, and here again I think this community would fully agree, data is very valuable and we can learn a lot from data. All of our important relationships are based on data exchanges. So you don't want a concept of privacy that says that flow must stop. Privacy, to be valuable and to be defensible, needs to be shown to be a positive societal value. And therefore, the idea is that we allow data flow, but what privacy wants is that flow be appropriate, and that's the defensible concept. And then you're saying, okay, what the heck? What is appropriate flow? And now we have the theory building. And the key concepts here are that you have these contextual informational norms. So the appropriate flow is flow that conforms, and this is a first approximation. So if you want to embody technology, privacy as contextual integrity into technology, you try formalize the norms and then embed them into the technical design. And similarly with policy, if you want to create law and policy, and I'll talk about a bit about that, I think, later. The policy part I've done less with in this work, in this talk. And then finally, to make sure that you have a morally legitimate concept, we say, actually, it's not that we want the informational norms to be conformed with, but rather the rules and the practices have to be legitimate, and that's going to be the source of privacy's moral standing, and I'm going to go through each of these steps. So the building blocks, in order to understand this theory, you need to know that the assumption underlying is that society isn't just an undifferentiated space, but it's constituted by differentiated social spheres. I did not make that. That's not my idea. I drew that idea from a lot of social philosophers and social theorists, and they use different terms. So Bourdieu uses the word fields, and then you have some institutional theorists use the term institution. You could have domains, you could have realms, and so forth. But I just used the term context because I didn't want to commit to any one of those approaches. But I wanted to take in this idea that, and there's nothing particularly mysterious when we think about social spheres, health, education, And it may be all societies have these domains, but they may be differently constructed in different societies over different periods and so forth. So the important to contextual integrity, the aspects, characteristics of the context. And here, by the way, the term context, as you know, is a very general English term. And you can use it, like I can say, in the context of this room. So when I'm talking about context in a way that's relevant to contextual integrity, I'm thinking about social domains of the kind I mentioned. And by the way, there's an article on my website if you're interested to pursue, which is, what is context, what isn't it, in relation to contextual integrity. And as such, contexts are actually defined by their purposes. What are they about? What are the goals of the context? So, and I say, a Martian can land in space from, Mars and describe this exact setting, or go into a classroom and describe everything that's happening and consider it as a description of education. But unless the Martian would say to its leaders, this is what the aim, this is what the purpose of this gathering is, you haven't fully explained what an educational context is or what a healthcare context is. Now, among the different characteristics of the context are norms. And some, which is, as we're all behaving as expected. Everyone is behaving as expected, except for the coughing, which is a little bit unexpected. Which is why I'm embarrassed, and you've been sympathetic. We know when something's happening. Not always, of course. And among the norms are these contextual informational norms, which prescribe how data should flow. Now, specifically, the contextual informational norms has this structure. And I'm hoping some of this can be useful in your thinking. Because you could have a norm that you describe in many ways, and obviously I've seen people talk about, perform surveys in the privacy domain, and I look at it and I cry, because to me some of the way the questions are asked is highly ambiguous. Because what you want when you are surveying people's reactions to certain kinds of data flows is you want to provide values for all the parameters in what I consider to be the fundamental parameters: the actor parameter, subject of the data, the sender, the recipient, the type of the information, and then this transmission principle. This is somewhat familiar, I'm sure, but the transmission principle explains how the constraints on the flow, the specific constraints. So sometimes you may hear about data, and again, data, you're the researcher, you're collecting the data, and you could say, but we only do it with the subject's consent. So then you have consent as a transmission principle, but that is not the only transmission principle. So maybe when you completing your tax returns and the IRS says, what was your income, you don't say, I'm not going to tell you, or it's not if you please, it's. So sometimes the flow is required, sometimes it's authorized. We have the Fourth Amendment, therefore the flow of the data is occurring with the judges, with a warrant, and so on. And we can come back. This is really, I'm not going to go through it, I just want you to glance at it and see, if you have a norm with all the values for all the parameters expressed, then it kind of looks like that. And here's the generality. All parameters matter. If you want to state what a rule is, that's non-ambiguous and complete from the perspective of contextual integrity, then you have to specify values for all the parameters. And, I ask this question again because I've looked at so many privacy surveys and so much regulation, even, GDPR, where it might just say, okay, here are categories of information that should be treated differently, but often not specifying the values for the parameters. And I'll say a little bit more when I go through some of the studies. This is taken from the actual privacy rule. I did some work with Anupam Datta, who's a computer scientist, and his students. In fact, they went through the entire HIPAA privacy rule, and they showed that, and there's a little exception of some of the difference, which I won't discuss now, but I'd happy to do. And they showed that, in fact, when regulators sit down and they carefully write out the privacy rules, they do, in fact, they weren't following contextual integrity, but they, in fact, are conforming to this kind of structure. This is a different one. I like to use this one because it goes, a covered entity can disclose a patient's psychotherapy note to the patient. So here it's the data subject and requires the patient's psychiatrist to approve of the flow. So there's an instance even in the law where the data subject does not have permission, does not have control if it's a data subject of a certain kind in a certain relationship and so forth. So the definition of privacy, and I'm saying first approximation because we're going to develop it more, is that information flows must conform with entrenched informational norms. And if they don't, and if they do, we say, well, they meet privacy expectations, and this is an important phrase in privacy law where judges might decide whether someone's privacy has been violated on the basis of whether reasonable expectations of privacy have been met. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try and work us through some further refinements of the theory, but I'm going to, because this group is mainly empiricists, and maybe I would enjoy some feedback from you on some of these, or maybe you have ideas of how to do more. I'm going to explain how an empirical perspective has been integrated into the past, 15 years of studying and applying and developing contextual integrity. One is to just check that it fits, because there have been arguments that, 5 parameters, maybe it should be 6 parameters, you don't have a use parameter. And so aspects of the theory, we need to test certain aspects of the theory and various proofs of the concept, just of the idea. And then we've also been using, and I say we, but it's not always myself involved, but folks who have been using contextual integrity to study privacy, to say, okay, we're going to develop privacy for IoT devices, and we're going to use contextual integrity as our framework for doing it. So it's accepting the theory and then showing how it can be applied. And there's, of course, some folks who are using it in the technical domain. For example, claims about what constitutes privacy-enhancing technology. It's controversial what counts as a privacy-enhancing technology, and some of us are pushing back against current definitions. And then we've been in an article I'll mention a little later, we're also looking at how you can use contextual integrity to inform law and regulation. Again, won't focus on that, but happy to discuss. So with this first approximation, the heuristic is this. If you're presented with, or let's say in your cases, you're designing some kind of study, you want to make sure that it's respects privacy, you may want to imagine what the data flows are that this tool, let's say it's an app that you've developed. You want to have some understanding of what the data flows are that you're generating with your app or with your study. You want to, if possible, locate norms that are relevant. Checking the conformance of the practices you're about to engage in or have engaged in against norms, against any entrenched norms. And then if if they conform, you're like, yay, everything, I've done the right thing. If they don't, then there's a red flag. It's not a no, it's not a stop, it's a, I need to investigate this a little bit more. And then there's the possibility where you're not sure which norms and so forth. Now, for example, in one, and this is something that, this was a project that kind of failed because the student who was working decided she wasn't doing a PhD after all. But basically, we've tried different ways of visualizing data flow. And I don't think we've satisfied this particular need. So let's say you are in the business of, you want to create a wearable or the accelerometer, or you want to have an app and so on. You want to do some work on mapping the data flows. How do you visualize that? And I know there are lots of visualization technologies. We haven't found one. And this was a kind of bespoke effort that we made. But one of the important things that I want to point out to you is that even though the person I was working with, Deborah Estrin, was saying this is small data, it's a closed community, your data, we don't share your data with anybody. But in the functioning of this app, which was like a back pain app, they integrated third-party functionality. They allowed a Google sign-in. They had third-party people helping with the analysis of the exercises or whatever it is. And even though they thought like, oh, this is all internal, but when they mapped it out, they noticed that there are these third-party what are they called, libraries, that where the researcher actually doesn't know what's happening with the data. Now, here's another way in which you can use contextual integrity. I like this example, and it was when Google Maps Street View came out, and people complained. They were very upset about it. And Google's engineers said, "What are you upset about? Our cars are driving around. They have this video equipment, and they're only taking pictures of what's public. If you're outside in your bikini sunbathing, or you've come out of a pawn shop, then it's a public street. How can you complain? Public is public. The assumption being that public is public. But of course, when you map out using the parameters, you see that at the very least, the recipient parameter changes, because now someone in Japan can see you sunbathing, even if it's in public or coming out of a pawn shop. And so, of course, Google, and then Google made some adjustments. I think some of the stimulus came from the EU of specifically the things that they did. We are seeing with personalized medicine, there's data that's being gathered that was never before gathered in the medical domain. So we could say they're disruptions of flow that are non-normative, unexpected. So pause for a moment there to just get to this other way of thinking, which is, how does contextual integrity contrast with some of the very common ways of thinking out there? Two, computer scientists would say if any data leaks, like imagine cryptographers, they want to say no data, none of the content should be leaked. And the other that is really dominant is, as you know, because consent is so dominant, that privacy amounts to control over information. And these differ from contextual integrity. And I want to show you specifically a view of leaking information, which is based on the private-public dichotomy. So public-private dichotomy is we have special rules for private information, but anything goes about public information. And I want to, these are empirical studies that get at the question of whether this really predominant conception of privacy as secrecy, how faithful to common use. And these are empirical studies with Kirsten Martin, which use, there are 3 of them that are available for you if you're interested. There are a bunch of other empirical studies that I'll mention, and they use the factorial vignette survey method, which I would like to think you guys are experts. You've got the vignette, you've got the parameters or the variables, and then we have the different values for the parameters. Oh wait, here, I meant to only have this one in. And then, is it okay? 100 minus 2 plus. I should have done some, maybe 120 to 100, etc. But we just did what we did. This particular study, because there's a view that says there's a lot of commonality in what types of information people consider to be private and to be treated in a different way. There's been a lot of investigation, and we replicated that. So Pew had done this, Alan Weston had done a bunch. And the Pew had done this, and we then, as I say, we replicated. I don't know if you can, whether it's readable, but we like social security, health, phone conversation, email, location. And then these are considered less sensitive: religion, friends, media, media habits, purchasing, and political views. What we wanted to show here is that even though there's agreement about the sensitivity, when you add the values for the other parameters, you find that there's sensitivity to that. And I would maybe this is the sort of most glaringly obvious one. Health data is considered sensitive on average. People have low tolerance for the flow for certain purposes, but obviously the flow to the doctor for the purpose of health, people are okay with that. So the idea here is that, I'll elaborate in a moment. The opposite is that there's the sense that, it's funny, my slides are coming out funny. The government has a whole set of records that are public records, which mean that anyone can walk into wherever they're kept, and now, of course, online, get access to the public records. Turns out that even though we have this system, and this goes, by the way, I won't talk about the location study, but this was, we were looking at location in public places, and of course people had pretty strong views about it. That I'm trying to see which one would be more fun, but let's say you're going for a job interview, and the company interviewing you wants to find out if you have a criminal record. Criminal records are public records, so the company could go to the courthouse records and see if you're listed, or it can ask you, or, so we're looking at sources and also transmission principles, or it can go to a data broker, a third-party data broker. And you can see that there's a huge difference among who they got the data from, even though it's the same data. Similarly, with control over personal information, we all pay lip service to this concept. When you think about control over personal information, in terms of contextual integrity, essentially what's happening is this definition reduces privacy to one parameter, which is the transmission principle, and to one value for it. So it's reductive. And we're all familiar with the terrible consequences of adopting this view. Here is this was from a few years ago. TikTok had the way longest. There's a lot of, there are folks at Carnegie Mellon who've done really just astonishing work revealing how nothing about privacy policies is working. And we had done this little study, and it's an empirical study, but not of humans. It was an empirical study of privacy policies, and we found that you could take a few sentences like this from Facebook's privacy policy, and when you spell it out in terms of the CI norm structure, you find that there are 126 permutations of what the practices are, and you think to yourself, I read these few sentences, I can speak English, this is pretty clear, but then this is, when I come back and quiz you, these are the 126 permutations that you need to have in your head. And this is a little bit of ongoing work among my colleagues, Noah Apthorpe and Jan Schwarzschneider. There is, as you may know, I have to say the NSF has thrown millions of dollars into research funds in how do we make privacy policies more legible and more understandable? How do we do opt-in, opt-out, all the different, and again, I think this community is well familiar. I don't think any of this works. The dilemma here is that you can make it clear and simple, and this is the effort. How many people are familiar with the nutrition label, app nutrition labels? Folks one person, 2, 3. So, and maybe if you're building an app, you're gonna have, you have to fill out whatever it is to create privacy nutrition label, they've already been doing studies on these nutrition labels, and it just turns out that people still don't know what they mean, even though they're very short and concise. It makes a lot of sense because whereas, this nutrition label, there's so much behind it. I read it, I know these are the required minerals that I'm interested in. How do I know that? That's because, we have nutritionists and so forth. There's a whole foundation. So what's wrong about the control definition that's interpreted as informed consent is that it punts the choice to the party who is least able to make a good decision. Now here's a problem. Here's the heuristic, and we said that there could be a problem when there's conflict with the norm, when the practice conflicts with the norm, or where maybe we don't even know what the relevant norm is. So the red flag is just the presumption. The presumption favors what's entrenched, what's normal. So if we left it at that with contextual integrity, it would be an extremely conservative theory. We just do what we've done before, never change anything. And that's a problem because technical disruption can bring about really good things for society. But we also need a method to figure out whether to be conservative or to go with these new practices. And one of the reasons for me is that why it's necessary is that I want the concept to carry moral weight. We can't just say, no change, or, Mark Zuckerberg, you designed Facebook. I remember there was a statement that he made which said, Facebook has changed the norms. And I pushed back and went, no, you didn't change the norms, you changed practice. Well, we don't know yet if you've changed the norms. So we don't necessarily just want to say go with the flow, but we want some kind of method. And this is where we are now, to discuss what is it that makes either a norm or a practice legitimate. Contextual integrity proposes the 3 layers of analysis. One is that with a practice, we want to be able to, as a policymaker often does, and then just stops there, they say, these are the stakeholders, and let's see what the impacts are. Or to just crassly, who are the winners, who are the losers, and then what the good policymaker might aim to do is achieve a balance. There's a lot of legal scholarship and philosophical work that looks at how privacy either promotes or undermines certain high-level ethical principles or political principles like autonomy, free speech, just general liberty, and so forth. But the one that we add in contextual integrity is to say, when we've situated this practice in a context, we want to evaluate how the practice or the norm promotes the contextual functions or the goals of the context, purposes, and values. And this is just back of the envelope sort of thing. These are, what are the aims of healthcare? What are the aims of education? And in any given society, I would suggest that these can be quite contested. The main thing to say is that when you're looking at data practices, they can have an impact on the achievement of certain contextual aims and purposes. And we need to therefore link the evaluation of data practices or the evaluation of norms against the achievement of these ends, purposes, and values. So, for example, in the case of personalized medicine, we might say, yeah, there's lots of disruption, but the purpose of them is to improve health outcomes in a very general, high-level way. And if I want to argue that it's okay, it's not because I went and I got consent from everybody who is being treated in this way. It's because I can show you that these new forms of data practice are effective in improving healthcare, whether or not there's consent. I'm not, we may add consent somewhere along the way, but consent in these circumstances is neither necessary nor sufficient. But showing the relationship between data practices and our health outcomes is essential for establishing that a certain practice is a legitimate or morally acceptable one. And some of you may know, and I won't go into detail, this particular study by your colleagues, and I was lucky to be brought in, where it shows individual acceptance of using health data. That we had done the study asking people, their acceptance of certain data flows, certain parties. But the one that was really stark was public health authorities during an epidemic. This is pre-COVID, and how accepting people are of data flows to the public health authority for the purposes of public health. And then came COVID, and we repeated this experiment. And what we found is that people were far more accepting of this data flow. And I'm waiting to hear from Frauke, but evidently now post-COVID, there's been a slight downward shift in acceptability. So the evaluation of data flows it's mainly for me. I mean, they may have other reasons for being interested in the outcome of the study, but for me it shows that even public acceptance of certain flows is related to the ends and purposes. And similarly for all these kinds of wearables and IoT devices. Now, there is a view, when I hear people talk about things like healthcare needs data and we need to trade off privacy for health, my pushback is that this is what's going on here is a problematic conception of privacy. That we're not trading off when we stipulate a restriction and we say health data about a patient to the physician for the purpose of blah blah. We flesh out this rule that there's no trade-off going on, because privacy requires the parameters have certain values. That is what privacy requires, and that promotes healthcare. So there is no trade-off. But instead, my slides are a bit out of order. I'm going to finish that little bit of logic in a sec. But here was a study I did with Heather Patterson. It's actually quite old. There's an article where we were looking at Fitbits and Fitbit data, and again, you see that people are highly selective in saying, I don't like that the Fitbit data is going to the workplace through the insurance, because some workplaces were offering people a reduced insurance premium if they would be willing to wear a Fitbit and have that data go to the workplaces. People found that cross-contextual flow was highly problematic. Again, they were quite accepting of that data going to the physician, but really not accepting of that data going to the workplace. So it wasn't just sheer flow. What mattered was the recipients. So again, I'm back to this. No need to trade privacy. When we come back to this article that I started out with, I'm interpreting how they use the term privacy, and the way they use the term privacy here is not as privacy, but rather as secrecy. So what they're arguing is that holding this data secret was not beneficial for improving the HIV care, but if you could allow the data to flow in the right way, you would not have a conflict between privacy and the uses for healthcare. So here's the updated. This is not now an approximation. Information flows conform with legitimate informational norms, or the information flows are legitimate. All right, this is my last slide, because I just wanted to talk about how colleagues and myself have been looking at this is quite a, I would say, scandalous discovery in the United States, not only with fertility tracking apps, but also with mental health. And that's interested in the wellness studies. But the use of the information that's drawn from the customers or the consumers, the users of these apps, where the data is then often sold as a profile to data brokers and to advertisers. So what we're trying to show is that if you look at these behaviors through the lens of contextual integrity, then you find that these need to be treated as healthcare, as actors in a healthcare domain. So there's not much here, but it's mainly to say that privacy, therefore, is not only to be seen as a benefit to individuals and contrary to societal values, but rather, and there's no trade-off with utility, but rather privacy to the extent that it's for the purpose of promoting contextual ends and purposes is also a societal value, and it's good for a society. It's good for a society to support this. And if you think about even health data, if people are trust that the data, whatever the data, but I'm just talking about health data. Andrew Mellon, for example, in the 1920s said, we're going to shut down the IRS, the Treasury Department data, because then citizens are more likely to answer the tax returns more truthfully. So if the norms are enforced, then you find that people are more generous with data. And as such, then, privacy as contextual integrity doesn't shut down data. It actually releases data. And that's why we think about privacy as contextual integrity as a positive conception of privacy, good for everybody, and supports these important societal and contextual ends. It means that instead of spending millions of dollars figuring out how to express consent, here is some of the knowledge we need to accrue. These are the collaborators, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over. Forgive me for that. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Helen. Well, we're ready for your questions, and I'm going to just check also questions from people online. I'll first take questions in the room. Peter?
So thanks, Helen. This was a really great talk, and it got me thinking, and I probably have a very simple or naive question. I don't know. So, maybe you noticed already that sometimes when we collect the data that we use, so sensitive data, we don't really know what the use of this kind of data is going to be at the very end, right? We sometimes combine it with other data, sometimes not. Sometimes we use it to investigate measurement error, right? And also some of these data can be seen as kind of like health data when it's about physical activity or not, right? So even as a data producer, I sometimes find it very hard, right, to think about what is the data for, why are we collecting it, what's the use. So the second step then, right, of communicating this to people is maybe even harder. So what is your experience with how can we? So maybe it links to the use that you sort of said, like maybe there's debate about whether that should be part of the framework, yes or no. So how do you view this issue that I am at least facing?
Yeah, I mean it's a fundamental question in this data science-y moment, and I don't have a pat answer, but the one thing I would say is that when you say use, I would encourage you to frame it as use for the purpose, because I think use could be very, it's kind of descriptive. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, but then when you add for the purpose, then it takes you a little bit closer to these goals and purposes and values. I mean, I don't think that consent is, as I've said before, I don't see consent as necessary and sufficient. It's much more important that the data is used for a purpose that is compatible with or promotes the purposes of the context. But the part that I'm going to be really strict about is to say that it might be very tempting to consider how it could be useful for some other purpose, but it would then be a violation from the point of view of, like, you might say, oh, well, we could sell it to marketers or something. And the thing about research that's so interesting to me, and I consider that a lot of the collection, even though it's for you might find that the data you've collected is useful for this purpose or that purpose, and another purpose that you hadn't even anticipated. There's a commonality in the research domain is like we're furthering human knowledge of ourselves and of society. I think this is a context. Research as intellectual part of the broader educational system. For me, that's what it has to meet that, even if it can be.
I'm not sure if this is a question or more consideration, but I am curious what you think. So, I have this issue about norms relating data and kind of comparing, organizations like Google or Facebook or others. That philosophy is just get as much data until the thing becomes regulated or illegal, versus researchers that need to go from the other way and might not be able to do things that other organizations do because of the ethics committee or just because it's new. And I feel like there are different norms depending on, the organization or who collects the data, even if it might be the same data, even if the purposes might be, better, even if the consent might be better. And so what's the norm there, or how do we deal with this difference in norms?
No, well, I don't know. When you say norms, we're talking about practices, so we need to regulate different parties in different ways. So if we recognize that you have entities like Google and Facebook, they're like used car salesmen, right? They're just going to say, we're going to just do what's profitable for us. The part that is frustrating is when they'll explain some kind of practice that they've newly adopted practice and then try and persuade society that it's like in your interest to let us do A, B, and C. If we could just look at the reality of it and say, these are companies, they're profit maximizing. We need to, as society, figure out what the rules should be and so on. Then for researchers, the ethics committees, I don't think the ethics committees understand how to deal with these kinds of questions. And so they often will just sit on something based on what's familiar, which is consent. And in the biomedical sciences, consent is a very important part of it for all sorts of historical reasons. But they should be asking, and they do, right? What purposes does this serve? What research purposes does this serve? That's the primary thing we should be asked. And then the other questions come afterwards.
Perry?
Yeah, what I wonder, when you talk about purpose, when you ask these sort of sense of this purpose, there's a sort of group of people around this purpose. What if there is no consensus, there is no
consensus, around that? I don't know, if you take education, so that's something that we looked into because I had written about these with a collaborator, online virtual learning platforms. And I was saying, I want to carry the argument all the way through, looking at how these online learning platforms have radically shifted the practices of data flow in education. And then let's see if we can link it to, and so she went off and this is a postdoc, and Ilana Zaidi went off, did a lot of research. And in fact, there's contestation because some people think it should be that education should be teaching the ABCs, and some people think, no, we want to do skill training for work, and other people think, no, we want to create independent thinkers and promote creativity. So you have your contested ends. Then there's still the question of how different kinds of monitoring of education would promote those particular ends. I don't know the answer to the question. I want to ask an educational psychologist. I want to ask someone who's running schools or teachers, what are the environments that best promote those ends? So the main point of contextual integrity is to link data flows to the ends, and then understand that those ends are contested and societies confront. Should we, in healthcare, should we vaccinate all the children? Should we prolong life? Should we, that's how, good question, but related.
But I think, if I may cut in while I wait for others to ask. So to say, well, we want your data, right, for the research purposes, which is true, it's also very vague for participants. So if you say, well, we're going to use it for the research purposes versus we're going to sell it, then it becomes very concrete. And the person says, well, no, for selling, I will not, right? So like your experiment, right? The person would say, no, for selling, I will not share. For research, then I would, right? But what we're seeing is that the sharing, the willingness to share, the sharing is quite low, I would say. And how to actually explain to people what we want from them is a challenge. And also how to figure, so as I understand it should be related to norms, right? But how to figure out these norms is also difficult. So Florian and myself did this study, and multiple people in this room, where we asked, well, how sensitive would you rate this information, right? And people have an understanding how they would rate certain types of information, but then still how they react to requests to share is very different from this. And this is a dilemma that we are facing, which I don't know the answer to. And I'm not expecting you to give this answer, but maybe it's, I'll be here to...
I should be able to address that.
Good, yes.
No, because that's what we were showing with the confounding variable. We're saying that, yes, you can say this is sensitive, these are sensitive data, but then we would showing that even in that case, if you fill in the values for the parameters in different ways, then people are going to respond to that very differently. So that might suggest to you that when first of all, I would argue that consent, it's up for grabs whether consent, how much of consent is necessary in any of these circumstances. But you provide your assurances. We will use the data for this purpose. Force you guys to say what the purposes are and articulate them, and then to stipulate the rules that you're going to follow with that data. We use it for this purpose only. These are the people who will have access to it, no one else. And then there's a question of trust. I would love to understand in those cases of people saying no, what that trust, whether they believe you're going to do what you say you're going to do. I think there's...
Adriana, sorry.
Yes, I think that's extremely interesting. And I know, for example, one researcher in the US who is doing brain research. So he works with people that are about to die, basically. And then he scans their brains, and then he asks them their whole life story in order to do brain research, just in context, basically. And I always found that very interesting because it's almost the opposite of all the, in the way it's presentable ways, it's almost the opposite of all the privacy regulations, or the way that is treated in research. But he has their consent, and he does everything very transparently. So he has all these cameras in his lab, and even people can just see how brains are just handled, and he does everything with care, and it's all very transparent. And I always found that very fascinating because he gets these people's consent, and they're actually sharing their life story and their brains and donating this for knowledge, which I found very inspiring. So what's your view on that? Is that because I guess, that's in this whole framework that you now present, that makes much more sense. Yeah.
I mean, the only little part of it that I would want to reinterpret a little bit is you may get the consent, but the consent is not what makes it okay. Yeah. What makes it okay is that this researcher is deepening our understanding of something. And it may be that we still want the consent, but the consent is not the thing between, I think, the Facebook and the Google, or not, a myriad others. It's that, say, with these mental health apps, and there's a lot going on in that, it's again, you may have given your consent, but it's rather a problem even though you've given your consent because of what they're doing with it. So that's the part that I would like to elevate and say that's what privacy is for.
Florian?
So if I understood it correctly from the discussion, I'm now thinking that maybe trust is the kind of like leverage that we potentially have, right? Like, because it's like we cannot manipulate people in the sense of that. I mean, so we have to tell people, like, if we're, as long as we're open, if we are very clear of what we do and what the purpose is, then it's okay. But still, someone could say like, no, I don't want to do it, right? And then, I mean, my understanding, your push would be, then that's it, right? Like, that we shouldn't try to manipulate people into pushing them in a certain direction. But then the question is like, the only thing we could change is trying to make people trust that what we are telling them on paper or saying is actually what's true, right?
Yeah.
Is that what
I mean, that would be a step. It could still be that someone would say no.
Sure.
You know, they may believe everything you've said, that you're only doing it to promote and further knowledge and all of those things. So like in that study with Frauke and Frederick and so on, there were still people who didn't. From a policy perspective, the part that, and I think I'm just maybe repeating, is the fact that we've made consent that given it like a 100% gatekeeping in. Obviously, we have regulations that do, especially in the US, we have a few sectoral areas where we've regulated, actually not very well, but it's just the strength, the weight that we've given to consent. And the argument here is, no, I expect much more from the parties, and if they give me what I want from the contextual point of view, then I'm going to be even more generous from, if I ruled the world, with what access to information they had. When the Census Bureau in the United States, when there's an imperative to fill your census form every 10 years, the Census Bureau had to firmly promise that that information would not be available for any other purposes. So it was, the access was conditioned on, and then it was okay. Then we could force people to fill the census, and we had certain public values that are at stake and so forth. So that's a cycle that kind of works. I mean, it has all sorts of issues.
Yes. All right. Yannick.
So, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I was wondering, like, if I do research, how much do I actually control what happens with my research? So, if I promise someone this is the purpose of it, and I, even in aggregated form, publish my paper, open access, I cannot control that. The only thing that happens with the data is in line with the purpose. So maybe some other people used my research to do things that I did not intend.
You mean the results of it, not the data? Yeah.
So can I even tell the participants what the purpose is if I cannot control that it's only used for this purpose?
Yeah.
So you can promise them not to share more data.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and I wonder if I want to think about the nature of the promise that you can make, and whether you can say that, it's actually like in the whole discussion of differential privacy, there's a big split in the community where your question is, as a researcher, you might say, I'm gathering this data and this is the purpose that I'm going to use it for. That's what I can promise. And then if you've you then discover something. Like, so the problem with differential privacy is I must, in a differentially private way, learn a fact about smoking causes cancer without revealing anything about who was in my sample. But then once I have that fact about smoking causes cancer, someone is walking out in the street smoking, I, on the basis of that knowledge, can infer that that person maybe has a higher chance of dying, you know, that kind of thing. So the scientific knowledge can be used in ways that I, as the researcher, did not intend. Yeah, so that all I can say is that it's a debate. You can only promise what you're going to do. But it's not about the consent. It's about whether your purposes are pure.
Yes.
Given that norms of privacy vary in context throughout the social world, there's some kind of domains of that world that are predicated on kind of violating the norms of others. I'm thinking like espionage, criminal investigation, and so forth. I mean, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, how would you respond to the suggestion that being an empirical social scientist is on some level about violating norms of privacy that exist in other elements of the social world? Because that's sort of fundamental to the generation of new knowledge.
I don't think that that's devilish. Because when we think about law enforcement, we allow law enforcement to act in ways that if someone else did it, we might consider it problematic. And the way we make it okay is that we create processes, like we create these procedural protections. We say a judge has to blah, 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 and sign off and so forth, and then we allow them to do, or espionage, same thing. So these cases are made not at an individual case by case, but rather at a societal level of how the practices are going to promote social safety. And I would say that with social scientists, same thing. It's like we create protections against harms by insisting that social scientists act according to certain rules. I'm feeling like I should stop because it's late. And
just to be mindful of the time. Yeah. Thank you so much again, Helen, for the keynote and for the inspiring discussion, everyone.